Good evening. Welcome and thank you for braving the bitter cold tonight. I checked the weather before I came downstairs, and we are going to get you home before it's actually 16 below, but it will still be cold when you leave, so prepare yourself. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're very excited about launching this series for the second year in a row. It's been very popular, and we know we're bringing you very exciting scientists, as you already know, and I appreciate you being here for the first event. Across campus before I start, I'd like to make you aware that this weekend, on Sunday, the Center for Collections and Research is doing a lecture about James Booth and his connection to the automotive industry. He was quite innovative. He was the son of George and Ellen Booth, and he was involved in the early days of the automotive industry, and some of his technology is still used today in some form. So that's Sunday at 2 o'clock at the Art Museum. That is free with admission to the museum. Additionally, we owe a great thanks to our promotional sponsor, Michigan Radio, for helping us with this series. We appreciate their support, and they help us bring this information to you, so thank you to them. Very pleased to start the series this time around with aquatic ecologist Matt Herbert. Matt works with a variety of resource managers and academic partners to improve our ability to effectively conserve aquatic systems, something that's very important to all of us in this area especially. His projects range from restoration of native Great Lakes fisheries, strategically increasing connectivity between the Great Lakes and tributary streams, and conservation of streams and agricultural watersheds. These projects generally emphasize identification of which conservation practices and what locations will provide the most effective conservation benefits, and development of tools to promote delivery of that information. You can see why I didn't memorize this. Matt joined the Nature Conservancy in Michigan in January 2007. He has a bachelor's degree from Iowa State University and a master's from Texas A&M. Before joining the Conservancy's Michigan chapter, Matt spent more than 3 years with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, working in the Natural Heritage Program. Prior to moving to Michigan, he worked in Illinois as an aquatic ecologist with the Conservation's Illinois chapter for 4 years, and with the Illinois Natural History Survey for 4 years as well. Matt, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for coming out tonight. Thanks to the Cranbrook for this partnership. The Nature Conservancy is very pleased with the partnership last year in the lecture series. So we're very excited to kick this off this year. Today, I'm going to talk about native fish restoration in the Great Lakes. In particular, I'm going to talk about the fish that occupy the open, deep waters of the Great Lakes, species like lake trout and lake herring. I'm going to talk about the history behind these fish and our relationship with these fish. Then I'm going to get into some of the issues with these fish, what happened to their populations, and where things are today. And then I'll get into some of the restoration that we're involved in. So before I get into that, I want to talk just a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. Many of you are familiar with TNC, but for those who aren't, our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends, and our vision is to leave a sustainable world for future generations. The Nature Conservancy was founded as an organization, a 501c3, in 1951. Prior to that, we were a committee within the Ecological Society of America, which is the Scientific Society for Ecologists. So from the very beginning, we were founded by scientists, and we've had a strong scientific foundation since the beginning. Globally, our priorities are driven by whole system conservation, whole systems being large geographic areas that have ecosystems that are driven by very similar processes, and the ecosystems are very interactive. Ecosystems like, or whole systems like the Everglades, or the Mississippi River Basin, or the Great Lakes Basin. And the Great Lakes Basin is one of 17 whole system priorities we have in North America. These are our whole system priorities. So we have to reflect that, we have a Great Lakes Project. In the Great Lakes Project, all of our state chapters work together towards conservation of the Great Lakes. Our goal in the Great Lakes is to ensure that the Great Lakes watershed is among the most effectively managed ecosystems on Earth. The work that we're doing in the Great Lakes is organized into 5 different strategic themes: northern forests, watersheds, coastal and nearshore areas, native fisheries, and aquatic invasive species. Today I'm going to be talking about native fisheries. The native fishery strategy, this is of course a map of Lake Michigan. You can see the lake is divided up into dark blue areas, and then along the lake margin, light blue areas. The dark blue areas are the deeper parts of the lake, basically deeper than 100 feet deep. And then the light blue areas are the nearshore areas, or the shallow water of the lake. Today, what I'm going to be talking about are the fish that occupy the deeper waters of the lake. The shallow waters of the lake are, species like yellow perch, walleye, species like that. If you're interested in coastal wetland conservation, that is definitely work that we do, but that work is organized within our coastal and nearshore areas. Species that are out here are species like lake trout, lake whitefish. Those species do occasionally utilize these nearshore areas, so there is some interaction between these two projects within these two strategies. Likewise, our native fisheries projects overlap a lot with aquatic invasive species, as you're going to see today. One of the projects I'm going to focus on is a project where our aquatic invasive species team works hand in hand with our native fisheries team. So for a long time, the open water fish of the Great Lakes have been important to people. Native Americans harvested open water fishes through various trapping and netting techniques. Species like lake trout and lake whitefish were very important to their sustenance, but they were also important from a cultural and a spiritual perspective. After Europeans settled the area, they very quickly realized what a great resource the Great Lakes were, very quickly began using these fish for sustenance as well. Gradually, we used those fish more and more, and eventually began commercially harvesting those fishes. So basically, we developed a fish economy. All over the region, many towns within the region, harvesting of fish was a major part of the economy. The way it worked was fish would be brought into towns like Green Bay, Sandusky, Ohio, Leland, Michigan, Alpena, Michigan, and in those towns, those fish would be processed, and then they would be shipped to larger markets like Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago. I want to point out here this is a boatload of lake herring. You can see that's very full. We're going to talk a lot about lake herring today, so I wanted to point out this boat and how full it is of lake herring. I'm guessing that many of you maybe haven't heard of lake herring. Can you show me your hands? How many people are familiar with lake herring? Okay, so there's not too many hands up. So. And we'll get into why we're not very familiar with lake herring, because things have changed a lot since this time. This is a map of western Lake Erie from 1885. You can see all along the shoreline are all of these lines. All of those lines represent a pound net out in the lake. This is a pound net. They were used for commercial fishing. The net had a line going out from it. Fish would swim up to the line and come in and get trapped in the net. You can see that this is extremely dense netting around Lake Erie. There's areas where the map actually had to be blown up to show how dense they were. And this is this is fairly dense for what was going on at the time. But all over the Great Lakes, we had very intensive fisheries going on. So this is a very simple schematic of Lake Michigan. Right now I'm gonna take you through and introduce you to some of these fish species. This is obviously a very simple schematic of Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan isn't shaped like a bathtub. This is in general the early 1900s, which would basically reflect historic conditions. So I'm gonna take you through the fish here in the subsequent slides. But as we go through this, I'm gonna point over here, and this part of the diagram is basically the deepest waters of the lakes, which is basically greater than 300 meters. When I point over here, I'm talking about roughly between 100 and 300 meters. And then every now and then I'm going to point over here, and that's the warmer waters that are less than 100 meters. Or, I'm sorry, I keep saying meters, I mean feet. So this is less than 100 feet. And on that map of Lake Michigan I showed earlier, over here would be the light blue areas. And just so you know how much of the Great Lakes is greater than 300 here. So a lot of the lakes, certainly most of the lakes are much deeper than that. All right, so first the lake trout. Lake trout were the top dog in the open waters of the Great Lakes. They ate everything. And they occurred everywhere. The arrows here mean that they occurred in the deepest waters. They occurred in the shallow waters, they occurred in the open waters near the top, and they occurred at the bottom. They were everywhere. Now, the populations of lake trout that occurred all over the place, there were actually unique types of lake trout. These lake trout down here still occur in Lake Superior. This is the lean lake trout. It occurs in basically these depths. This is the Ciscoette. It occurs out here in the really deep waters. And this is called the humper, which is basically kind of the intermediate waters. And historically, Lake Michigan had this much diversity and more. There's records of old commercial fishing records that indicate there were probably at least 14 different types of lake trout in Lake Michigan historically. Unfortunately, we lost all of those, and I'll get into that more later. And right now, all we have in Lake Michigan is the lean lake trout. So really only over here. And they're maintained by stocking. The next group is what we call the corygonids, and they call them the corygonids because they all have the same genus, the genus Corygonus. These species include 6 Deepwater Ciscos species, these guys here, as well as lake whitefish and lake herring. This group was, if you're familiar with cichlids in the African rift lakes, which there are thousands of cichlids that have diversified in those lakes, these are really our cichlids. The Great Lakes were pretty young systems. They were only like 10,000 years old when we came over and started utilizing them. If we would have given the lakes another 100,000 years, there probably would have been a whole bunch of different corygonid species, because these species, not only, just like the lake trout where there are different types, within these species there were different types as well. And there was already a lot of diversity built up. In fact, these 5 species were already endemic to the Great Lakes, which means they occurred nowhere else in the world except for the Great Lakes. And a spoiler alert, this species, the Deepwater Cisco and the short-nosed Cisco, these are extinct because of the changes that I'm going to talk about. And then I also want to point out that both lake trout and whitefish and lake herring, they do move into those shallow waters during the winter. All of these species like cold water. The lakes, that nearshore zone gets too warm for them in the summertime. But these guys move in the early winter. They'll move into nearshore areas and spawn. In fact, pretty much all lake herring and lake whitefish spawn in nearshore areas, whereas lake trout, they spawn all over the place, historically. Now they basically only spawn in nearshore areas. And then along the bottom of the lake, we have burbot and various sculpin species. And I'm not going to spend time on these guys. These guys are doing pretty good. All right, so this graph goes from 1890 to 1990, and again, this is for Lake Michigan. All of my examples throughout this talk, I keep coming back to Lake Michigan, but in general, the same things were happening in Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Ontario, and for the most part, Lake Erie as well. Lake Superior, most of it was kind of immune to most of these problems. So Lake Superior is really kind of our reference lake, the lake that we would like to get some of these populations back to. So this graph is commercial catch of these fish species in Lake Michigan from 1890 to 1990. Now, remember that map that we showed, that we looked at for Western Lake Erie Basin with that really intense pound nets? So we know that, and the data definitely support this, by 1890, there were a lot of impacts already on these populations from overfishing and from pollution. So even at the beginning of this graph, there were a lot of problems already. But what I want to point to here is what was happening in the middle 1900s. So for lake trout, you can see there was this huge crash in around 1950, and they basically disappeared. Now you see them come up again in the 1980s, but that's only because we stock them. And so basically they're out there now because we maintain them by stocking. Similarly, lake herring have this huge crash in the 1960s, and they don't return. We still have small remnant populations of lake herring in all 4 of the lower lakes, but that's all they are, is really small remnant populations. And then lake whitefish, they also crashed, but they came back. And when they came back after we started controlling sea lamprey. So sea lamprey was a problem for them, but they returned. Sea lamprey also was a problem for lake trout, but once we started controlling them, we still didn't see the lake trout come back because lake trout were impacted by other things as well. So what are the different things that were impacting these fish? We have overfishing, which we talked about, certainly contributed to these problems. Pollution definitely contributed to these problems, especially for lake herring, because the particular habitats that they use for spawning and especially for nursery habitat are many of the places that have been really polluted. However, for pollution and for overfishing, a lot of the problems that occurred in the 50s and 60s, a lot of those problems are better. Many of the places where lake herring were hurt back in the 60s, many of those places are cleaned up and are ready for their potential return. And overfishing, our fisheries are way better managed than they were in the early 1900s. And then habitat destruction, we had lots of habitat destruction issues through navigations channels, marinas, other changes we made to the lakes. But there is still a lot of habitat out there that's high quality. And then invasive species. And I can't do invasive species justice. Many of you were here last year when Lindsay Chatterton talked about invasive species. His whole presentation was on invasive species. The best I can do is provide a couple of different examples of invasive problems that are particularly relevant to what I'm talking about today. Before we move on, I want to point out in the graph here, this is alewife. The next slide, I'm focusing on the alewife problems, but you can see about the same time that all of our native fish were crashing, alewife were exploding. Alewife came into the Great Lakes through canals, and the timing was very similar to when sea lamprey came in. So alewife came in about that time, and it was the same time that lake trout were crashing. There was nothing to eat the alewife, and so alewife exploded and they took off, and they were the main thing that was out in the lakes at the time. So throughout the 60s and 70s, that was the main thing out there. If you lived in the Great Lakes region at the time, you probably remember huge alewife die-offs in the springtime, and that was partly because they were so overpopulated. We started stocking Pacific salmon in, and by the 80s, there was still a lot of alewife out there, but at least they were under some control. So what problems do alewife cause? One of the problems with alewife is they eat a lot of zooplankton, which is the food that most of our native fish eat when they're small, so they were out competing our native fish. While they're out there eating zooplankton, they also eat small fish of our native, the small juveniles of our native fish. And it just so happens that the locations where alewife are they're at the right place at the right time to have impacts on walleye, yellow perch, emerald shiners, lake trout, many of our native species. So they were kind of holding many of our native species in check, not allowing them to recover. Another problem with alewife is they were basically the main food source out there. And alewife aren't adapted to the Great Lakes, so their populations would fluctuate like crazy, which can be a problem if you're trying to manage a fishery and the food that your fishery is eating is not very stable. And then one other problem is that again, they were the main food source out there, so the lake trout that we were stocking out there, that's what the lake trout were eating, was alewife. The problem for lake trout is that the alewife have a high concentration of a chemical called thymidase, which binds with thiamine. And so the lake trout would have a thiamine deficiency, which really didn't hurt the lake trout as adults, but they would produce eggs and lay the eggs, and then the eggs were not viable, so the eggs wouldn't hatch. And what eggs did hatch, the juveniles would generally die. So basically, they were preventing lake trout from naturally reproducing. The other invasives that I want to talk about are round gobies and rusty crayfish. These are newer to the scene. They're a lot newer than alewife. Round gobies came in around 1990. They came in on the ballast water of ships. They very quickly started expanding. Many of you are probably familiar with them. They occur in very high densities around the Great Lakes. And then the rusty crayfish, they are a little bit further behind the gobies, but they have spread a lot too, and where they've made it to, they also occur in extremely high densities. And both of these species love to eat eggs of fish, and they occur in the same habitats that many of the fish that I'm talking about today, where they lay their eggs. So these guys are there waiting to eat eggs. All right, so this is our bathtub picture from before at the top, from the historic conditions, and this is where things stand currently. So I'm just going to show how things have changed. Historically, we had those 6 deepwater species of fish, of ciscos. Only one of them is left, and that's the bloater. And the bloater happens to be the most shallow-oriented of the 6, and even it has shifted its habitat to be even more. So we have this huge depopulated area at the deepest waters of the lakes. Lake trout occurred all over the lake. I already talked about this. Lake trout are pretty much only in the shallow waters. And historically, where we had whitefish and lake herring, now we still have whitefish, fortunately, but we have alewife and smelt, which again, smelt are also a non-native species, and they also feed on the juveniles of a lot of native fish. So together, alewife and smelt have a lot of impacts on native fish species. All right, so up until about 15 years ago, the picture for these native fish in the lower Great Lakes was pretty bleak. We really didn't have a lot of aspirations to restore these populations. But there's been some very big changes recently that have kind of changed the mindset. How many people here, just a quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with zebra mussels? Okay, nearly everybody. How many people are familiar with quagga mussels? A lot of people are familiar with quagga mussels as well. I think there was a few more hands for zebra mussels than quagga mussels, which is kind of what I expected. There's a couple reasons for that. One is that when these guys were introduced around 1989, and soon after that, basically within the first 2 years, zebra mussels exploded, and they were all over the Great Lakes within a couple of years. Quagga mussels didn't do that. They kind of hung out and kind of acclimated for a while before they started to expand. The other reason is that they kind of look alike and they're hard to tell apart, and so a lot of times we just collectively call them both zebra mussels. They're from the same genus, they look a lot alike, so often we just lump them together. But the difference between them is actually extremely important. So zebra mussels, they like to occur on rocks. They'll also use pipes and any other hard surfaces, whereas quagga mussels, they like those hard surfaces, but they can also handle living on silt or clay or sand or a whole variety of substrates, and that's really important for what happened when they expanded. So down here, this is what happened with zebra mussels as they expanded. This is in the mid-90s. This is in 2000. This is when they were about at their peak. Since 2000, this is 2005 and 2010, they've been declining. And there's really not very many zebra mussels out there anymore. But during this same period, from 2000 to 2010, quagga mussels were taking over. Now, at their peak, zebra mussels were pretty much restricted to those rocky habitats, whereas quagga mussels, they don't care. They can occupy all kinds of habitats. So by 2010, they were all over the lake. So there was a study that estimated there were 950 trillion quagga mussels in Lake Michigan. So there's a lot of quagga mussels out there, and they've had pretty serious impacts. So one of the major things that quagga mussels have done, they're filter feeders, like all mussels are. So they're always pulling water in, taking nutrients out, and so gradually, Lake Michigan, the nitrogen and phosphorus levels are lowering significantly. So really, Lake Michigan is very much like Lake Superior is. As they're pulling that nitrogen and phosphorus out, we've got lower phytoplankton populations. We've got lower zooplankton populations. The small fish eat the zooplankton, so those are declining. And of course, the big fish depend on the small fish. So this causes a lot of problems, and this has been very, very, very much a concern. Now, it also created a window of opportunity, which I don't want to speak highly of these guys because they've caused a lot of problems, and I'm even glossing over some of the other problems that they've created because I'm speaking specifically to native fish restoration. But they, from the specific issue of native fish restoration, they actually have kind of created a window of opportunity to reestablish some of these native fish. Remember, Lake Superior didn't experience the declines that Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and Lake Ontario and Lake Erie experienced with these fish. So since Lake Michigan is more like Lake Superior, there's kind of an opportunity right now. Now, alewife right now are either at or near record lows in all of the lower lakes. Many of you are familiar with the alewife collapse that occurred in Lake Huron in 2003. Soon after that, the Pacific salmon population crashed. It was very unfortunate. It hit the economy of the region very hard, and it was very worrying to regional managers. Now, the good thing is, within a couple of years, all of these good things started happening to at least help compensate for those impacts. Walleye populations have exploded in Lake Huron. There's more walleye in Lake Huron than in recent memory. Certainly, I would say since before the alewife came in. There's lake perch are doing well. We've actually seen a fair amount of natural reproduction of lake trout. So there's lots of good things happening related to this, and so with that, there's kind of this window of opportunity to reestablish these fish. We don't know whether this collapse is permanent or temporary for alewife, but either way, if it's temporary, then let's establish these native fish so when they come back, we have a diversity of prey fish. If it's permanent, then we need to establish something else that basically to take their place in the food chain. So we have this opportunity. If it works, ultimately, we want to see a more stable prey base. I talked about how alewife populations fluctuate a lot. If we have a diversity of prey out there, they may fluctuate too, but when one population is up, the chances are that something else will take their place, which should level out the prey base a little bit. And in addition to that, if we can establish these native species, it should lead to the recovery of lake trout, which is important because we spend millions of dollars stocking lake trout every year, and they're obviously an important part of the system. So this is what we want to see. We want to see a diverse prey base. Instead of just a prey base that's reliant only on alewife, that can sometimes lead to something like this. All right, so what kind of work are we doing related to this? So this is Grand Traverse Bay. Grand Traverse Bay, if you're not familiar with it, is located in the northwest part of the Lower Peninsula. This is Traverse City's in here, Petoskey's up in here. And we're working on 6 different spawning reefs in this area. Two reefs in Little Traverse Bay and 4 reefs in Grand Traverse Bay. 3 of those reefs are, in this picture, are basically right on top of each other. They're hard to see, but we'll zoom in a little bit later. Now, when we say reefs in the Great Lakes, what are we talking about? My guess is most of you, when you hear reefs, you picture something like this, a coral reef in the ocean, something like this. Well, really, all a reef is a chain of rocks or coral at or near the surface of the water, something that kind of breaks up a monotonous bottom of the lake sticking up. So in the Great Lakes, this is what a reef looks like. Great big rocky area with either boulders or cobble. Usually it's linear in shape because the glaciers are what brought these in and formed them. So this is what a reef looks like, and these reefs are very important to fish. Why are these important to fish? Well, the fish, which I forgot to mention, these 3 reefs right here are what really brought us to this area to start with. Those 3 reefs are the only places that we know of left where lake herring spawn in Lake Michigan. And remember that boatload of lake herring we saw earlier? We know that lake herring were extremely abundant. It was the most common fish eaten by lake trout historically, and they were certainly important for us for commercial fishing. So we know it was extremely common, and now it's just relegated to this small area in Grand Traverse Bay. We want to build that population up. It just so happens that lake trout and lake whitefish also spawn in these reefs. So as we do things to help lake herring, we'll also be helping those populations.
What about the cormorants? Where did they come in?
Cormorants are native, but the populations are very high relative to what they were historically. For the populations I'm talking about, these are pretty deep water species, and I'm not sure that I don't know of any evidence of impacts from cormorants from these guys. Usually people talk about yellow perch when they're talking about cormorants. All right, so these fish come into these reefs, and they will drop their eggs on the reef, and their eggs kind of work their way down into the rocks, and that's really important. I didn't mean for the fish to come in yet. So the fish could lay their eggs down here on the bottom, but then at that point they're exposed to the elements, they're exposed to predators. Also, the bottom of the lake doesn't have as much oxygen, whereas if they're in the rocks up here, in the spaces in the rocks, it could help hide them from predators. It helps to protect them from wave action and other things. And they're up in the rocks that when the waves come in, the waves work their way through the rocks easily, bathing them with oxygen and keeping those eggs really highly oxygenated. So these reefs are very important, very handy for the fish. However, of course, I talked about before the rusty crayfish and round goby. Those guys, being on the reef, create a lot of problems for the eggs. The round goby and rusty crayfish, they love being in the rocks, and they definitely take their toll on the eggs. And also, we certainly lose some eggs to wave action, but particularly in cases where the habitat isn't as high a quality. So the work we're doing in Grand Traverse Bay is to do habitat restoration, attempt to control these predator populations, these round goby and rusty crayfish, and ultimately we want to increase egg survival and increase the adult populations that are coming into spawn. For this project, we're working very closely with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, Central Michigan University, and Smith Root, which is a company out of Portland, Oregon, and I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of them later. We've received funding for this project through EPA, through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, and we have had some funding from foundations and private donations as well. Specifically, the Dole Family Foundation provided some funding, and then other funding is just through the Great Lakes Project. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the monitoring, but the monitoring is extremely important because it's very important to us to be able to quantify what the benefits of the work is. So I do want to talk about it just a little bit. Our efforts to monitor the fish and their the reproductive success. So we have two ways that we're sampling the eggs and monitoring them. You can watch the eggs kind of disappear from this funnel here. So in the reef, we've embedded these egg bags, and we've embedded these funnels. And the funnel is open. There's a tube here, and then we can pull a boat up and just suck the eggs out through this tube. The funnel allows us to, the eggs fall quickly down into the funnel. And so the funnel allows us to estimate the density of eggs laid on the reef without any effect from predation, or at least minimal effect from predation and wave action. Whereas the egg bags sit on the reef for several weeks. And so the difference between what ends up in those egg bags after a few weeks and what we initially saw in the funnel tells us how many eggs were lost due to either predation or wave action. All right, so the habitat work that we're doing. This is in close to those yellow points that were right on top of each other before. We call them the dock, the reef, and the point site. Again, these are the three locations where all three of those species reproduce. The only place that we know where lake herrings still spawn in Lake Michigan. So the dock site, we call it the dock site because there's an old dock that went through the site. You can see it's an old dock. There's no dock there anymore, just the pilings there. But the pilings go right down into the rock. There's also other debris down there. And the habitat on the dock site is not very good. The fish still use it, but not as much. And what eggs are deposited there have much lower survival. So this is the site that we want to restore. What we want to do is we want to bring in limestone. The dimensions of the limestone and how it's shaped, we want to base that on the two adjacent reefs that are much higher quality and have much more success for these fish. This is the reef site. This is a beautiful reef. You can see some of our sampling equipment. But the substrate here is great. The fish love this site. They do great on it. This is the point site. The point site has a lot more boulders to it, but it's still a really nice reef. And the fish still do quite well on that site as well. This is a graph showing egg deposition on the three reefs in 2008 and 2009. The names are different. This is the dock site, the reef site, and the point site. But you can see the dock site does much poorer. The fish use it way less. And then part of the same study, we were able to show that the eggs' survival is a lot lower as well. Primarily due to wave action, because the depth of the reef it's not as deep as the other sites, and so the eggs aren't as protected, and so the eggs get easily washed out. So that's where, when we bring in limestone, add some depth to that reef, it'll help protect the eggs better. And then our work to control round goby and rusty crayfish. This is work that we've already begun. How many fish do you see in this picture? Just go ahead and yell out some numbers.
3.
Okay, 5 is the highest I heard. Yep, there's 10 fish in this picture. There's gobies all over these reefs. You can see this is our sampling equipment here, and there's just gobies all over the place. And to be honest, this actually isn't even that dense. There's tons of gobies out there, and you'll see this habitat with even much higher densities of gobies. They're all over the place. Now you don't see the crayfish in here, but they're there as well. They're just not as photogenic. They like to hide under the rocks. If you were out there and you were diving and could turn over some rocks, you'd see lots of crayfish as well. They're both there, hanging out, waiting for the eggs waiting for the fish to come in and drop eggs. So our general strategy with the invasive control is first to identify promising technologies. This is particularly for the gobies because we're also using traditional technology that we we felt a lot more confident that they would work on the crayfish, and we wanted to make sure that we were pursuing other technologies to help deal with the goby. So we're looking for promising technologies, testing traditional and new technologies for their ability to control the predators, and then we're quantifying how much it costs to do that work, both in time and money, and also quantifying the benefits, and the benefits being in the increased fish spawning success. And then finally, we want to evaluate the benefits relative to the costs to see whether these strategies are things that we could begin to expand to other reef locations and grow these populations, especially the lake herring population. We want to build that lake herring population up. So for the traditional techniques, we have tried a lot of different techniques, different trapping and netting and divers pulling up crayfish. This is a minnow trap over here. This is an old gill net that the DNR was discarding. We converted it into something we call a tangle net. We put some salmon carcasses from fish cleaning stations, wrapped them up in there, just laid the net on the bottom. Crayfish come in, they love to feed on those carcasses, but then they get caught up in the net and we're able to pull those out. So we started this work in 2012, and again, we tried all kinds of different methods, and we were testing to see which ones were better. We tested how, for each method, which technique for it was better. One thing that we found were much higher crayfish densities than we expected. That was very important, and we also found that when we were out there during cold temperatures, the gobies were pretty lethargic. They really were not very active at all, but the crayfish were still pretty active. So it's anecdotal at this point, but we think that there's a good chance that the crayfish, it's cold when the fish come in to spawn too, and given that the crayfish are so active when it's cold, we think there's a good chance that the crayfish really are more of a problem from an egg predation perspective than the gobies. We also found that both species were the densities were a lot higher on that dock site, on that degraded site. So we are basically hypothesizing that if we restore that site, maybe we'll see lower densities of the egg predators, which will be a very important result, because that would indicate that if we improve habitat in other important areas, maybe that will decrease the predator densities as well. And then finally, we saw pretty encouraging reductions in densities. However, this graph is just a couple of the sites showing a decreasing trend through August and September. And then we got here in late September, and then we saw this big spike, and we saw this on the other reefs as well. So it looks like the crayfish and the gobies actually are moving on to the reefs. We don't know why for sure, but it's actually very possible that they have already learned that there's a nice food source of eggs coming onto these reefs in the fall, and so they're moving towards those reefs. So in this last year, in 2013, we used what we learned in 2012. We shifted the timing, so our control efforts were much more focused in the fall, particularly September and October, to try and address that spike that happened at the end, because that's really important, because the fish, the lake trout, are the first ones to come in and spawn, and they come in mid-October is when they begin to come in. So all that control effort, if they just come back onto the reef right before they spawn, all the control we did in the summer really doesn't help. So we focused the work in 2013 in the fall. We also used methods that were much more effective based on what we learned in 2012. We had way more success collecting crayfish. We were very happy about that. Certainly for the amount of effort we put into it, we had way more success. We got way more than twice as many crayfish in 2013. Unfortunately, the fall is a hard time to sample, and this fall in particular was very difficult. We had a very hard time getting out there because of the weather. We got blown off the lake a lot. So what we decided to do was to, our plan was to focus on controlling on 4 reefs, and we really intensively controlled on 2 reefs, and then the other 2 reefs we got out there and controlled, but not very intensively. This graph shows that same spike in the fall when we saw that big spike going up, and this is all the reefs. But the dock reef and the crib are the two reefs that we were doing the intensive controls on. Now the dock site did go up. We did see the spike, but the crib site, we didn't see a spike at all. And the dock site, even though we saw the spike, it was a much lower spike than the other sites. So we feel like this is a really good sign that our control efforts actually kind of held that big influx of crayfish onto the site, kind of held them back. We also saw a big reduction in the average size of the crayfish, which we expected because a lot of the gear is more selective towards larger crayfish. So we were getting rid of the large crayfish, which is a good thing because they're going to eat a lot more eggs than the small crayfish. And then we stopped control, and by December we actually were seeing we could tell that there were crayfish moving back onto the site already. So this tells us that we can, using traditional methods, we can reduce densities of crayfish. That's exciting. Right now we're still analyzing the egg data, so this is pretty recent stuff. So, but it was a very exciting for us that we had positive results, particularly given the weather concerns. So that was something that we were very concerned about, was the weather. But even despite getting blown off so much, it still looks like we had benefits. So then with our innovative control efforts, the new technology. So the technology that we've been working with is the seismic technology, or the seismic gun. The seismic gun is basically a hydraulic fed by a hydraulic pump. You shoot water, either water or air, under high pressure into the water, either down in the water or horizontally in the water, and it creates a high pressure wave that moves through the water. If you're a fish in the water, you're going to experience your body is basically going to expand and contract, and there's a lot of potential for it to have some effects on you. This technology had been tested on invasive species in the Pacific Northwest with a lot of success, and we had a lot of conversations and a lot of evaluation, and it looked like it had a lot of promise for round goby. In fact, in a way, we thought it might be more effective on round goby because the fish that it was tested on out west were fish that their reaction to stress is to escape. The round goby's reaction to stress is to go down on the rocks and hide. So making them repeatedly successful to different waves of this seismic technology. We had no idea, it had never been tested on crayfish. We had no idea if it would work on crayfish or not, but we went ahead and tested it as well. So this is what it looks like deployed in the water. This is before it was dropped into the water, so it basically, you just got a cable, you drop it down, and then this buoy suspends it in the water. We conducted very intensive tests in July. We test these cages either have gobies or crayfish in them. We dropped cages at different distances away from the seismic gun. We did it over different depths. We did it over different substrates. We shot the gun various numbers of times, and we did this on both crayfish and gobies. And then we held the fish for 14 days. And we also fed them to see if there was any difference in their feeding rates. So it was a very intensive effort to quantify this. And it was very important to us to understand how it affected the fish, because the whole idea was then to go in October before the lake trout came into spawn and try to clean off the reefs, get rid of the goby off the reefs, so that we didn't have all these predators there when the fish came into spawn. And these experiments were going to tell us exactly how to treat. We ended up repeating these experiments again in October with a larger gun. And really what we found out is that goby are really hardy fish. It was very disappointing. We tested on other fish, and it definitely worked on other fish, but gobies are pretty amazing. I don't like gobies, but I have a lot of respect for gobies. It also didn't work on the crayfish. Again, we didn't necessarily expect it to work on the crayfish, but it didn't. So right now on the emerging technologies end, we're kind of in evaluation mode. We're looking at other techniques. We don't want to jump into anything, but we definitely are looking at some things and doing our due diligence to make sure that before we look at something else, we definitely have reason to believe it will be effective. I want to just briefly mention our colleagues in New York are working on a project with lake herring that's very complementary to our project in Grand Traverse Bay. Unlike us in Grand Traverse Bay, where we know where they're spawning, they have no idea where the remnant population is in Lake Ontario. So basically, they're looking for the remnant population, trying to figure out what habitat it spawns on. And this is important because the state of New York and the Geological Survey, they're beginning to raise lake herring and stock them into the lake. And our colleagues in New York want to figure out where the remnant population is so that we're not stocking on top of that remnant population. Another thing that I wanted to mention is these are those 6 deepwater species I talked about. Only the bloater is left in Lake Michigan. The other 5 are gone. I mentioned earlier that 2 of them are extinct, but the blackfin, the kai, and the short-jaw cisco, they all occur in Lake Superior. And given that we have this window of opportunity right now in Lake Michigan and in the other lower Great Lakes, we think there's a good chance that maybe the time is ripe to think about maybe reestablish them again. And right now I'm on a working group that's part of the Lake Michigan Technical Committee of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission to do a white paper to kind of evaluate what the situation is with these guys and whether we can begin to think about reintroducing them. And if we can reestablish 1 or 2 of these deepwater species, maybe we can think about those deepwater lake trout forms that I talked about earlier. So again, ultimately, we want to reestablish this diversity of prey items through reestablishing our native fish. And we want to avoid only having alewife out there. Since we first identified this window of opportunity and began this work about 6 years ago, we've been very encouraged by things that are happening in the lakes. There has been a little bit of natural reproduction in Lake Michigan for lake trout. Our lake herring population that we're working with in Grand Traverse Bay, there are signs that it's increasing, and it also looks like they're moving into Little Traverse Bay more than they were historically. We're very excited about that. It really kind of fits with what we thought was going to happen with this window of opportunity, but we want to help those populations along. It's going to take a lot to get that lake herring population to really grow using other reefs all over northern Lake Michigan, but that's where we want to get to. And we want to see a lot more of this too. And I just want to, I already showed this same slide, but I just want to reiterate that we wouldn't be able to do this work without the work of our partners and funders as well. So I just want to acknowledge that again. And with that, I'd like to say thank you. I'll take some questions. Melissa wanted me to put up my Twitter handle. You can follow me at Twitter. I do tweet about this kind of stuff a lot. So if you're on Twitter, I'd encourage you to follow me. And I also want to plug really quick the rest of the lecture series. There's some great stuff coming up. Dr. Scott Sola is going to be talking next month about how we're using technology to advance our conservation. Mary Fail is going to be talking in in March about balancing farming with freshwater conservation. And then Chris May is going to be talking in April about technologies for protecting rare species and habitats. And these guys are all great, and I guarantee they're going to be very interesting talks. And I also want to encourage you, whether you're familiar with the Nature Conservancy or not, to check out our website, either nature.org or just our general website, or our Michigan or our Great Lakes pages. You can follow us on Facebook as well at this address. I'm very proud of the work that the Nature Conservancy does, and I work with a lot of great people, and we do a lot of good work. So I would really encourage you to check out some of the things that are going on.
So while they may not yet be in the Great Lakes, you haven't talked about the threat of Asian carp. Can you comment on that, and what, if anything, the Nature Conservancy is doing to preclude their coming in, if in fact they're not in? I know there's some about that they may already be in.
Yeah, so so it's an extremely important issue. The reason why I didn't, so the question was about, oh, I'm sorry. The question was about Asian carp, and I didn't really talk about Asian carp, so the question was how important is that, and what are we doing anything about it? The reason why I didn't talk about Asian carp is because Asian carp are a very real threat to the Great Lakes. They eat a lot of plankton, both zooplankton, but also they'll shift over to eating algae as well. I don't think the open waters, that dark blue area that I was focused on today, it's not really the habitat for them. However, our coastal wetlands and a lot of our rivers would be good habitat for them. And so that's why I didn't talk about it, but you're totally right that it's an extremely important issue. And we are doing work related to that. Many of you are probably familiar with the environmental DNA or the eDNA work going on. My colleague Lindsay Chatterton, who works with us, but he works out of Notre Dame through our partnership with Notre Dame. It was actually his idea to begin looking for them with that eDNA. And so together with Notre Dame and other partners, we began looking for them, and they were the ones that initially found eDNA samples beyond the electric barrier in Chicago. So that's really what the excitement just a few years ago that got all this talk going on. That was really because of one of my colleagues. So he's been working with partners trying to sample all over the region to figure out where else they might be and make sure that they're not anywhere else. And the biggest concern about those guys is there may be some that have gotten across, but we really have to stop them now, even if some have gotten across, because it really takes a critical mass to get across, and is some of our larger river systems. So we don't want to see them in the Grand River, the Fox River, some of our larger rivers. So, yeah.
Question. I'm not familiar with the habitat where you have your 3 rock reefs, but I fish a lot in Lake St. Clair, and the smallmouth bass love gobies and they love crabs. Is that smallmouth bass habitat?
Well, pretty much everywhere in the Great Lakes, smallmouth have been increasing, and a lot of it is exactly what you said. They are doing well with the gobies. And in Grand Traverse Bay, the smallmouth population has been increasing.
What about if they introduce planted more smallmouth there?
We've talked about that, and we've had a lot of conversations with the DNR. On my slide, I have predator manipulation as one of the things that we're considering. We've talked about potentially creating, not on the reefs because we don't want to mess up the reefs, but potentially creating attractive habitat around the reef to attract more bass to it. But honestly, the reefs themselves are pretty good habitat, and that dock that's there, there's a lot of bass around. I think it's more a matter of just that population continuing to build up. There are places, Lake Erie and actually Lake St. Clair, there are signs that the goby densities are actually declining a little bit because of the smallmouth. Yeah. This bass are growing better too with the goby diet. Yeah.
What about this? We're in the Lachino Islands, and the milfoil is just going crazy up there, and it seems like it's just choking out everything on the bottom.
Yeah, I'm familiar with Eurasian milfoil, and it's definitely invaded this region, and there are many different lakes where it is doing exactly what you said. It's really dense, choking out other native species. It actually makes it difficult. It makes it difficult to fish, but also different fish like it and different fish don't like it. So it'll cause a change in the fish community as well. I know a few years ago, Lindsay, the same guy who was doing the eDNA work, he led an effort to. It wasn't as far north as you are, but he was working in inland lakes, trying to look at the spread of that species and other aquatic plants. But that's about the closest thing that I can comment on that we've worked on. But you're right, it definitely is a big issue. Back here.
Yeah. What is the impact of the DNR stocking of non-native fish on what you would like to see happen?
So, like Pacific salmon, for instance. So, to be honest, Pacific salmon really, I mean, in a way, are part of the solution because the alewife are the bigger problem. There were major concerns about the alewife crash because of the loss of Pacific salmon. So in a way, there's some complexities there and some disagreements. But for the most part, right now, everybody just wants prey fish. They want something for the fish to eat, and pretty much everybody is in agreement that if we can reestablish these native fish, great. Many people still want to see the alewife return, but my perspective is let's get the native fish, and when alewife return, let's make sure that we have a diversity of fish, because we don't even know if the alewife will ever return. But the Pacific salmon themselves, I mean, it may be that we need Pacific salmon out there. We need to continue to have them out there to keep the alewife from ever completely taking over again. So my perspective, I mean, I don't see Pacific salmon as affecting lake trout directly, or even most of our other native species. They mostly do eat alewife, and they might eat the fish that they might eat lake trout or lake herring and some of these other Cisco species too. I think that's fine. I don't think they're going to prevent them from reestablishing, though. I think they would have to get abundant enough already for salmon to start shifting over and eating them. So I don't really see salmon as a barrier to the establishment of these, and if anything, potentially an ally. So there was right here.
Did I understand that it was the mussel that allowed the water to become like Lake Superior?
Yeah, and I want to make sure to stress that I am not a zebra mussel fan or a quagga mussel fan. They have caused a lot of problems. I didn't talk about this, but they get on the reefs and they cause a lot of reef problems. They're not a problem on the reefs that we're working on, but some reefs they're on and causing a lot of problems. So I am not a fan of zebra mussels and quagga mussels. But it is true that the shift that quagga mussels have caused in the food web, it has changed the lakes. It has changed Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, so it is more like Lake Superior. And I say let's run with that opportunity and try and reestablish these native fish. But it is they were a part of that.
But did I see on the slide that they were time bombs? Are you expecting that they might shift over and become a problem instead of a help? Is that what the slide said? No,
it was an article basically. In fact, the article was early on when they were, that was about 3 years ago, before there was a lot of alewife decline in Lake Michigan, and that the time bomb they were really talking about. That article was talking about the concern of alewife decline, very similar to the concern that people had in Lake Huron. When that alewife population collapsed in Lake Huron in 2003, I mean, pretty much the perspective was this is horrible and nothing possibly can come of this that's good. And it did cause a lot of problems, but we've learned subsequently that there was a lot of good things that did happen after that decline. The walleye populations that we have now, lake trout starting to return. There are definitely good things about it. And again, it gives us an opportunity to be thinking about some of these other species that we haven't talked about for decades.
So there's not a real big concern about the mussels?
I mean, they've taken their toll already. They've already caused a lot of changes. Again, there were some things that I glossed over, like I didn't talk about how they affect spawning habitat. They also, there are problems with them related to the near shore. So those populations, even though the open waters, those dark blue areas, are like Lake Superior and really low in nutrients, the nearshore areas are actually the opposite. We still have a lot of, you're probably familiar with all the cladophora or the green algae that's growing on the rocks and causing problems. And really what's happening is the zebra mussels and the quagga mussels are pulling in all the nutrients and locking them up near the bottom. And so that causes other problems that I didn't really have time to get into. So I'm not a fan of them, but I think for the most part, what the problems that they're going to create, they've already done that. At least nothing else that I can foresee. Yeah.
How long is your funding for? How long will you be doing this research?
So our EPA funding we're nearing the end of our EPA funding. We don't have funding right now to do the crayfish work next year, which is unfortunate because we have a lot of good things that we found, but we've also got a lot of things we want to follow up on. So our crayfish control, we had enough money for 2012 and 2013, and now we're looking for additional funding for that. The rock work, which we haven't started yet, right now we have partial funding for that. We're looking for more funding for that, and we're actually going through the process of trying to get a permit for that. So that, if everything fell together right, we could potentially do that this summer. I think more likely the following summer is when that work would go on. And ideally we find a way to keep the invasive control going as well, because it would be nice if we're doing both, if we can able to kind of combine that with the invasive work. Particularly since the monitoring is similar for both, we can actually take advantage of that. So yeah.
Is there a market to eat those crayfish?
Potentially. We talked about that a lot. It would take some time to set that up, and we were already stretched to have enough people out there to do all the work that we wanted to do. We did talk about it though, and potentially that's a way to kind of fund something like that in the future. Now, many of the crayfish that we're pulling off of there are not that big. Certainly some of them are, but many of them would not be very, would be so small they wouldn't be very good for marketable conditions or whatever. But what's that? Yeah, it depends. Maybe it depends on how you cook them, because I've had crayfish that are pretty good. So. But you're thinking along the right lines. I mean, there are different groups that have started having these same rusty crayfish. They invade wetlands, they invade inland lakes. They use a lot of different habitats, and there are actually groups that have started annual crayfish boils. They go out and they collect them, and they have started having fundraisers and stuff. And to be honest, we knew about that, and we knew of a couple of situations where they had done that, and then the following year, for their second annual event, they went out to get the crayfish and they couldn't find any. And that was actually part of what was really encouraging to us. Our whole goal wasn't to eliminate gobies from Lake Michigan. I mean, that's not going to happen. But these reefs are, not that big of an area, and the footprint that they have, their ecological effect on Lake Michigan is way larger than the footprint of the reefs themselves. And so for us, this is a nice small area where if we can figure out how to remove these invasives from that specific habitat, it can have a much larger effect than just that small little area. But we're not going to get rid of them. They're still going to be there, and they're still going to even recolonize. So, but that crayfish situation did, yeah.
Yes, do you interact with the DNR? Because I know they established habitat like in the Saddle River. How do you interact with the DNR as far as restoration?
So this Grand Traverse Bay project, we were out right with the DNR and all of that work. Those experiments, the seismic gun experiments we were doing, we had July, we spent 2 weeks, including a full weekend. We had about about 6 Nature Conservancy staff, about 9 people from the DNR, a bunch of folks from Central Michigan University, all of us working hard. We had 4 different boats going back and forth, testing all of this stuff. So we work very close to with the DNR. This project, we've had like project calls every other week for a few years now. So we're extremely, I mean, it's totally hand in hand with the DNR. Oh, I forgot to say, so I mentioned early that one of our partners was the Smith Root Corporation. Smith Root, in Portland, that's the guy who developed it, and he had tested it in the Pacific Northwest. And so that we had heard about it, so we had several phone calls with him to basically do the due diligence to see whether it really had promise for gobies, and it really did sound very promising. You know, it looked like the stars were aligned. Really, our question was not will it work, but how well will it work? And it didn't work. But that's what experiments are about. You know, we always called it an experiment. We knew it was an experiment. We always called it that because we didn't want to say it would work when we didn't know, and it didn't work. So, but that's the way it goes. So. Yeah, so. Really? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Not at the beginning. Yeah.
How are you? Nice to see you.
Good job, Matt.